I was married for 35 years and the love of my life passed away. This is my last chance to find meaning in life. And it's like, oh my God, this is terrible. Hey, what's poppin'?
Hello.
Hey, welcome to Left Unread.
Welcome. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in radical self-education.
That's right. We're simply two human animals trying to transcend the boundaries of animal oppression.
Ooh, lovely. This time around, we are continuing our read of Dr. Karl Marx's...
Doctor is in the house. Capital, Volume 1. Yes, this time around we read in the new translation chapters 10 and 11 having to do with relative surplus value and also cooperation. How was this section for you, Aaron?
Pretty light, to be honest. I think maybe I'm just getting better at understanding the arguments in the book, but I didn't have to fight through my understanding of the concepts he was outlining in both of these chapters. So it went pretty smoothly in that way. And also, they're pretty short chapters in their own right, so there wasn't a whole lot to it. Yeah,
definitely. I would agree. I mean, we're building our Marxian muscle.
Marxian muscle.
It's a bit of a bummer, though, because the cooperation chapter is hand in hand with the next two chapters as well, right? Like cooperation, division of labor, and then finally machinery are all ways that Marx describes ways that individual relative surplus value can be increased. So it's a bit of a bummer that we stopped on 11, but how are we supposed to know? You know?
You don't know till you do it.
Yeah. Not to mention this, they've already done something weird with the chapters here. I don't know if they've combined chapters early on. Like, that's what it seems, but we are 2 chapters ahead of where the original, or the 76 translation at least, was at.
Yeah, it caught up with us chapter, 7 or something like that. So that somewhere something happened where they redesignated the chapter delineations for whatever reason. So sorry if you're reading another translation and you're like, ooh, chapter 10.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, we are talking about, not unfortunately at all. Fortunately, we are talking about the concept of relative surplus value.
Correct.
And I will say, too, in terms of building that muscle, I was able to follow his numerical examples here for maybe the first time. So quite nice in that fact.
Yeah, I actually like the way he opens this chapter with the analogy of line AC and using that to delineate necessary labor and surplus labor. So he says, imagine that there is a line, AC, namely ABC represents a working day of 12 hours, and then segment AB is your necessary labor, segment BC is your surplus labor, and he's using that to kind of frame the way that the working day is fixed.
Yeah.
But there has to be a way for the capitalist to increase surplus value through surplus labor without going outside of the confines of line AC of the working day. I thought that was a pretty interesting and useful kind of analogy.
Yeah, I think so too, because, there are certain assumptions that Marx is making here in the setup for this, idea of relative surplus value. But it's things like, the working day is fixed, people are being paid their full wages, labor is being fulfilled in that regard. And so I think it's, in terms of his argument, what's actually forcing the capitalist, maybe not forcing, but what's incentivizing the capitalist to act in a specific way lies within the boundaries of that limit. The limit of the working day, it can't be extended more than a certain amount. We're just going to assume that it is at this certain amount. It could be changed one way or the other, but for the context of this example, what Marx is talking about is the capitalist isn't going to make more money just by expanding the working day. It's fixed, right? So the question then is, how can they make more money? Well, there's certain things that can be done within the working day.
Yeah, and I think the point of it being a 12-hour day, it doesn't matter, really.
Honest to God, he's doing the math teacher example. I'm so serious.
What do you mean?
He's set it up so that all of his examples give nice round numbers,
Yeah.
6 pence in 12 hours is 6 shillings and that much.
Yeah.
Still not strong on shillings to pence to pounds. Duh. Pound. No. Is a shilling a pound?
I don't fucking know.
Fuck. I came
you
prepared.
Had it last time.
Yeah, I did. It doesn't matter. We're not doing this. But that's the reason why, he's like, oh, it's 1 shilling over 20 hours and it's 20 shillings. And I'm so serious. He sets up the example so they'll give nice rounded numbers.
I get that.
Yeah.
And I get why he would choose to do that. But also, I guess what I was getting at was that the principle remains the same, whether the working day is 12 hours or 8 hours and 35 minutes, which is clearly not as easy to break into chunks and give examples for.
My 6-hour 45 shift with 2 15-minute breaks and a mandatory 30-minute lunch.
Exactly.
Okay.
I guess just to jump immediately into the text, he kind of opens the chapter at the end of the first paragraph with the question, how can additional surplus value be produced? In other words, how can the surplus labor be prolonged without extending AC any further or irrespective of its extension? So that's the fundamental question that he's seeking to answer here as he's exploring relative surplus value.
Yeah, and just to start there, he says that you can't just reduce the necessary labor time because then the person couldn't fulfill their means of subsistence, right? They wouldn't be paid adequately to the point where they could then reproduce labor, etc. So it's not necessarily looking at the necessary labor time here right this second at least, because I know he does come back to it later. I'm just looking at 286. What changes isn't how long the workday is, but how it is divided into necessary and surplus labor.
Yeah.
Right, and he does some setup here. So an hour of labor is represented in half a shilling. That's 6 pence. What idiot in England decided that 12 would be our base, not 10? That's why they're clearly an inferior culture. No. So a worker must work 10 hours daily to replace the value of the capital that pays for his labor power. So just to set some basic things up there. We know his means of subsistence, we know the value of his labor, and if we know the value of his labor, we know the magnitude of his necessary labor time. So these are all things that we can find just by looking at, the context of the workday.
Yeah.
Okay. This first section of the chapter is just very direct. Like, we want to expand surplus value. You can't decrease the necessary labor time because of these reasons, right? So then what has to happen? Well, you might say you could pay the worker less as well, right? 4 shillings 6 pence instead of the 5, which does in fact play an important part in determining the real movement of wages. However, we will skip over it here, Marx says. So, still making some assumptions. In order for the labor power to fall by 10%, it takes less time to produce the same quantity of workers' means of subsistence, so 9 hours of labor instead of 10. That means that the labor power must be increased. So, I think it can get a little confusing here, but what Marx is saying, is that they want to increase the power of labor so that the value of that labor will decrease because less material will be required for that labor power to be sustained. Am I getting that right? I'm looking about halfway down 287.
Yeah.
Right where it says, now in order for labor power's value to fall by 10%, it must take less time to produce the same quantity of workers' means of subsistence, right?
Yeah.
In order to do that, you have to increase labor's productive power. And he starts to talk about what makes up the means of subsistence. If you change some of the methods that go into producing the means of subsistence and the means can be produced more easily, right, or for cheaper, then that means that the amount required to fulfill the laborer's needs of subsistence is less.
Yes.
So by increasing the power, we've decreased the value, which means that less value is required in order to be reproduced.
Yes. That is correct.
Okay.
That is my understanding.
That's my understanding too. But that brings with it something really interesting because the question is then, how can you increase labor power? The first thing that Marx talks about is like literally the input goods. I'm looking on 288 now. Capital has to upend the technological and social conditions of the labor process and thus the mode of production itself in order to increase labor's productivity. In order to use greater productive power and reduce the value of labor power and thereby shorten the part of the working day needed to reproduce that value. So just exactly what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. We're just trying to wring as much as we can out of our current working day.
Yeah, I guess just to say, I think if we're reducing this to its simplest concept, the idea that there is necessary labor time embedded in the working day, it's called necessary labor time because that's what's necessary to sustain the subsistence of the worker. So there's little that can be done there, but what you're saying is there is a way to kind of go around it by decreasing the value of goods, right? The goods being produced. We increase the opportunity for profit because the cost of necessary labor would inherently go down.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is too is that in real economics, my God, in classical economic studies, this is done all the time. It's called a market basket of goods, right? They're looking at literally a full basket of goods that a consumer might purchase, and that's where they come up with all these indexes. Like CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is partially drawn from a study of a market basket of goods. So it's not unusual. right? It's not anything crazy. And I love the way at the bottom of 288 where he talks about that. A cheaper product reduces labor power's value only pro tanto, so in proportion, right? You might say that a shirt is a necessary means of subsistence. I thought that was really funny. But the thing is that in terms of the costs, what a laborer might spend on a shirt is comparatively pretty small.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when we're talking about the costs of the means of subsistence here, you know, there are things that take up a much bigger portion of that. I mean, probably food is the biggest one. I mean, right, if you just think about what a laborer has to pay, you know, you can take this into the real world and say, what are your actual costs? You know, there's so many times where I'll finish one of these sections and then just be like, this is like someone's dealing with, you know, like you learn this in a business class, right? Your expenses versus your profits and whatnot. It's a similar thing going on here.
The thing that I took from this chapter most, and he kind of doesn't really get there fully until the end of the chapter, so I was kind of hanging back because I didn't want to just immediately jump to the end.
Yeah.
But really, this is a discussion around productivity.
Yeah.
It's about how do you make the most stuff with a fixed amount of necessary labor time.
Yes.
The way to do that is by increasing the productivity of the worker.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't get there until the very end of the chapter, though.
Yeah.
So.
You know, honestly, a lot of this section reminded me of was when we read Wage, Labor, and Capital. I mean, I know that this is capital, but especially on the next page when he's talking about, you know, they come up with this technological innovation, or maybe it's an organizational innovation, and that allows the capitalist to produce goods at less than the social value.
Yeah.
Right? So that's an important thing here, right? We're talking about the fact that whatever the social value of a product is, the individual capitalist can gain some of that surplus value, that relative surplus value for himself for a limited time. It mirrors what we read in Wage, Labor, and Capital because Marx is talking about that same process, right? Some kind of innovation allows the capitalist to produce more goods in the same period of time, but that comes with its own consequences, right? On 290, if you produce 24 instead of 12, well, guess what? That means that the capitalist must do twice as much business, i.e. double his sales. So in order to conquer a greater share of the market, that means he has to sell at a lower cost.
Mm-hmm. Below its social value.
Yeah, so above his costs of production, because he wants to make profit still, but below the social value one, he can capture more of the market, but two, because he has to capture more of the market. He literally has more product to sell now because of his new and innovative process.
Not to take us off track, but reading this part and hearing you explain it now, it's clicking with me a little bit differently. I'm thinking a lot more about preconditions in capital and how that allows a capitalist to make a quote-unquote unsound business decision in the short term in order to monopolize a market in the long term.
Sure. A loss leader.
Yeah, that is exactly what Amazon did. Amazon worked at a loss for a number of years basically to eradicate all of their competition, and then they can jack up the price. It's the same thing that happened when Walmart's first started to spread
Every
all
tech
around
startup, I mean, I don't think Uber has been profitable a single year, you know, but they're still a hugely valued company.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, something interesting to think about here is the way that when we're talking about these innovations, we're not necessarily talking about technology. In fact, the biggest innovations in the recent sphere of capitalism have been in our organizational structure. David Harvey mentions subcontracting. He talks about just-in-time delivery. All of these different features which allow the capitalist to wring more productivity out of these hours are not coming from any technological source, but literally, in the case of like Uber and whatnot, it's like literally a labor loophole, but it's because they're actually restructuring the organization of their production. So I think that don't necessarily think of these innovations as specifically machinery, specifically technology. Sometimes it could be just as simple as like a new way of looking at the labor law, which then allows Uber to not pay for benefits, you know, which is just a big slash in all of their expenses.
Yeah.
So
it could be operational or something like that.
And the problem too is that an independent contractor on its own is not like an evil thing. Like there are relations of business where it makes sense to have independent contractorship. I can understand why those things have been put into place, legally speaking, because of the kind of system that we're currently living under. But it's so interesting to think about the fact that all of the newest innovations in tech come from exploiting those regulations, basically.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's the whole tech entrepreneur motto, right? Move fast and break things.
But yeah, like I was thinking about the reason I mentioned preconditions. Sorry, I didn't really finish this point, I guess. But like in a case like Amazon, the precondition is to have enough capital to operate at that loss for however many years it takes you to corner the market. And even if it's not operating truly at a loss, like Marx is describing here, where it's like you can still make a profit, but you're selling it below the social value of a thing. There's still a precondition there that presumes a certain amount of starting capital or something like that in order to manage that.
Well, even in the cooperation chapter, I know I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but he says that the capitalist doesn't really take control of that principle of cooperation until they have enough labor employed to set the social average.
Yeah.
You have to have such a mass of workers that it's affecting the social average of labor in that regard. Just having like an individual couple of people doesn't do that thing. I mean, it's the same kind of thing with the startup costs.
Yeah.
I just simply know that eventually he will get to this, but it's part of primitive accumulation even, where literally people were separated from the land. The capitalists accumulated that capital in the beginning, by force. So I know that that's a bit of foreshadowing here, but we will eventually see that come into play.
And that's also related to what he talks about in the cooperation chapter with like scale and the means of production. Yeah. So we'll touch on that again shortly. These
chapters were appealing to my economist brain, because I was thinking about like economies of scale and things like that for a lot of this. And now it's like, oh yeah, that's absolutely a big factor here.
Yeah.
Okay. So he does give a numerical example where he talks about, I'm not going to lay it out here, but I actually think that the easier way to look at it is on 291. Right? He says one could take a different path and get to the same result, right? In this numerical example where he's saying a capitalist comes up with an innovative process and he can instead produce 24 products instead of 12. I think that this section here on 291 probably explains it the easiest to me. The value of the product of a 12-hour working day is 20 shillings, right? So they've worked 12 hours under the new process, they've made 20 shillings. 12 of the 20 belong to the value of the means of production, merely reappealing, so the constant capital. The remaining 8 shillings is thus the value of the workday, right? So that 8 shillings represents the remainder of the day. But if you compare that to the price of the labor for that day, there's a disconnect, right? The money expression is greater than the socially average labor of the same type. 12 hours of such labor is only 6 shillings. So literally out of nowhere, out of thin air, 2 shillings has appeared. Where does that come from? That's exactly the surplus that Marx is talking about. Those 2 paragraphs in line, because before he does 2/3 of the total labor and 1/3 of it, 5/6 of the workday, the surplus only 1/6. That's not helpful for me. But looking at the fact that the rest of the workday is expressed in 8 shilling, where it only costs 6 shillings, that was a much clearer example.
Yeah, it's much more straightforward than 14 2/5.
Yeah. He set up the example so smoothly when he was talking about shillings and 24 hours and 12 hours and whatnot, but then he had to deal with 14 2/5 of the constant capital. But yeah, there we go. Now, one thing to mention is that technological advantage doesn't stick around. Just like we talked about in Wage, Labor, and Capital, that process is disseminated out to the rest of the capitalists because they see the value within it.
Yeah.
So it's not kept. It's wiped away, right? The differences between the individual value of commodity and the social value is wiped away, Marx says. And this is kind of where he starts to talk about that irresistible law of competition. I know before in the previous episodes, we were looking out for supply and demand, right? And I think that this is really where that starts to come into place. There's one part here in the compendium that I thought was actually pretty interesting about supply and demand here.
In Harvey's Companion?
I said compendium, didn't I? Yes, in A Companion to Marx's Capital by David Harvey. He's talking about supply and demand conditions, and he says, Marx concedes that the conditions play a vital surface role in generating price movements for a particular commodity. But when supply and demand are in equilibrium, he argues, supply and demand fail to explain anything. They can explain, for example, why shirts exchange for shoes on an average ratio. So it's not that supply and demand are completely out of this equation. They're still important for the change in the price itself, but it doesn't necessarily let us compare 2 different products, in the same way that a value comparison based on labor might.
Okay.
So just thought I'd mention that since you had supply and demand on the mind.
You're referencing my questions about scarcity?
Yeah.
Yes? Yeah. That makes sense. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, no. Nothing crazy. I mean, I think these were really straightforward chapters.
Yeah. We're closing the chapter now on the last 2 pages here. On 292, Marx ultimately tells us a commodity's absolute value isn't in itself of any interest to the capitalist who produces the commodity. All that interests him is the surplus value embedded in his commodity, the surplus value he can realize upon selling it. So not that motive really matters all of that much, but that is a pretty clear indicator that the point isn't what is being produced. The point is to squeeze out of what is being produced the surplus labor of a worker that can be 100% exploited in a workday.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting because something that Marx hasn't made a distinction in is the type of good, like a luxury good, a wage good, any of those things. And it's because like what you're selling the product for doesn't matter to the capitalist. They would sell dirt if they could make money from it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The product doesn't matter itself, because that's a criticism that Marx brings up here. You might say, if all you care about is the exchange value itself, why are you trying to lower the exchange values? Why would you make a cheaper commodity? And it's because the cheapness of the commodity doesn't matter. Even if you're selling something for $1, if 98 cents of that dollar are surplus, right, you only have to pay the 2 cents to the laborer, then that's a huge rate of exploitation. Far above 100%, if I'm being frank.
Yeah.
So that's really important here, because we're not talking about like a specific product, like why not make the most expensive luxury good possible? It's because the quality of the good, the price of the good isn't what matters. It's how much can be wrung out of the labor to make it.
If something is sold for $60,000, but it costs $59,000 to produce, the margin of profit being stolen there is so low that there's probably not a great deal of value, is probably the wrong word to say.
Sure.
There's probably not a lot of reason to pursue that as a capitalist, where your example where something costs $1, but you can get 98 cents of surplus value out of it, then obviously that's the way to go, because the rate of surplus value being pilfered from that is much higher. But that is what, to me, was the primary point of this chapter, which he gets to on the last page, is about productivity then. So it's not, again, it's not about what is being produced or even how much it costs to produce so much as how much surplus value can be stolen through its production. And a large part of that comes with how productive can you make the worker in that amount of time.
Yeah.
And he gives a couple of quotes on the very last page on 293 about that. To start, he says, under capitalist production, the point isn't to shorten the workday. Capitalist production wants only to shorten the labor time required to produce a certain quantity of commodities. So shorten labor time, not the workday, because if you do that, then you can get more surplus value out of the workday. When enhanced productive power enables a worker to make a commodity 10 times faster than he used to, capitalist is hardly prevented from having him work 12-hour days, just as before, from having him produce 1,200 units instead of 120.
Yeah.
So again, it comes down to like how much can be made in that amount of time, because that amount of time is fixed. And then lastly, what sealed it all up for me, near the end of that page, he writes, under capitalist production, the purpose of developing labor's productive power is to compress the part of the workday when a worker has to work for himself, meaning necessary labor, and thereby enlarge the part when he can work for the capitalist for free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. To what extent can this be done without also lowering the value of the commodities?
Exactly.
Right. And man, you know what I was thinking about, dude? In the last episode, we talked a ton about how the workday has been regulated, but only within the limits of the law, dude. I was watching Deadliest Catch the other day. We just been throwing it on because it's slop, Mm-hmm. We were sick of romance slop and we wanted danger slop instead.
What romance slop do you watch?
Well,
The Bachelor?
Well, we did watch Golden Bachelor and Golden Bachelorette, which
yeah.
were interesting experiences, I'll say that much. It's so different. This is not a Bachelor podcast.
Love on the Spectrum is one that people like too.
I refuse to watch it.
Thank
I
you,
refuse to watch it. It's disgusting.
I'm sorry, you were going to talk about Golden Bachelor.
Golden Bachelor is so interesting because these are people, the Bachelor, the regular Bachelor, everyone is like super catty, and they're like, I gotta fight for my love or whatever. In the Golden Bachelor, people are like, I was married for 35 years and the love of my life passed away. This is my last chance to find meaning in life. And it's like, oh my God, this is terrible. Anyway, we were watching Deadliest Catch though, and those motherfuckers, there ain't no labor law out there on the ocean, dude.
Oh, fuck no.
Those guys are working 20 hours on, 4 hours off. I'm like, that's criminal shit.
Yeah.
So, honestly, what I was thinking about it here when he was talking about, when enhanced productive power enables a worker to make a commodity 10 times faster, a capitalist is hardly prevented from having him work 12-hour days, just as before, from having him produce 1,200 units instead of 120. In fact, the worker's workday might even be extended, right? So, it's fucked, man.
Yeah. Shit is fucked.
Shit is fucked. So?
On to chapter 11.
On to chapter 11, just like that.
Yeah. Cooperation. Now, this is another one that I feel like doesn't necessarily work in a particularly linear fashion, because the chapter begins on page 294, but I think he doesn't really give you even a definition of what he means by cooperation until 297.
Yeah. This chapter was interesting to me because I was a little confused, honestly. I was a little confused about the distinction between cooperation under capitalist production and historical forms of cooperation. Because he spends a lot of this chapter talking about how cooperation has existed plenty previously.
Yeah.
You know, like the pyramids, like all of that stuff. But then at the end, he says that it's peculiar to capitalist production. And I'm not exactly sure I understand what makes the distinction.
Let's get into it and see if I understand.
Okay, because there were some interesting things that I pulled from this chapter, but I don't understand what makes it distinct to capitalism.
Well, I mean, I have a quote that maybe speaks to that, but before we do that, let's just lay out his definition of cooperation in a capitalist mode of production.
Sure.
On 297, he says, the form of labor that involves many people working together systematically, either in the same production process or in different but connected processes of production, is called cooperation. So, pretty straightforward definition, I guess. I don't really know why you would need that defined.
It's what you'd expect.
Yeah, but I do appreciate that it has allowances for stuff that you mentioned before, like subcontracting or different things like that, where it's not necessarily all the workers working, in lockstep making one thing by all pulling the lever at the
not
same
like an assembly
time.
line. Yeah.
But it could be where this group of workers makes the engine block, this group of workers makes the gasket, and then ultimately they all get assembled to be together. That also qualifies as cooperation under this definition. The quote that maybe we'll get to your question is a little further back on 306.
Okay.
Because he is, again, he's kind of talking about historical situations where cooperation of labor has existed. At the top, he says that it's based partly on communal ownership of the conditions of production and partly on the fact that individuals haven't managed to tear the umbilical cord tying them to their clan any more than individual bees tear the bond to the hive. The sporadic use of large-scale cooperation in the ancient world, the Middle Ages, and modern colonies rests on direct relations of servitude, or most often slavery. And then, I guess, the quote that I actually had written down is further down. Its precondition, a large number of wage laborers being employed concurrently in a single labor process, is the point where capitalist production begins, where capital itself begins to exist. So the distinction, I guess, that he's drawing there, as I'm understanding it, is cooperation previously has all happened under forms of subjugation and servitude, namely slavery, where here, even though you're still a wage slave under capitalism, the difference is a large number of wage laborers being employed under a single labor process is where it turns into capital. Yeah, I guess I don't see a difference there either.
Right. Well, I think there is something about that voluntary subjugation there, I guess. I mean, I'm looking on the page previous, right? He says, the capitalist pays for the value of labor power of 100 independent workers, but not for their combined labor power. As independent persons, the worker are isolated. They enter into a relation with the capitalist, but not with one another. They begin to cooperate only in the labor process, but by then they have already ceased to belong to themselves. The moment they enter the process, they're incorporated into capital.
Yeah.
So,
That feels semantic, though. I mean, like, to suggest that being forced into servitude under slavery is different than being coerced into servitude under capitalism. The servitude remains,
I'm not sure I really understand. I'm just thinking about a lot of things here because, like, he talks about, I know we're working backwards, but he's talking about, like, the kind of control that must be exerted over a larger group of workers. He talks about the creation of, like, supervisory positions, overseer positions, and all of that.
Yeah.
But I'm not exactly sure where it goes, how it differentiates it from the historical form still. There's clearly benefits to cooperation.
Well, I mean, he starts the chapter, he says, on 294, he writes, both historically and conceptually, the starting point of capitalist production is a large number of workers working together at the same time and in the same space,
right,
under the command of a single capitalist, all in order to produce a single type of commodity. And then he closes that paragraph by saying all that happened was that the guildmaster's workshop was enlarged.
Yeah.
Because he's using this analogy of the guildmaster, which is the same sort of thing. You have a single, quote, master, furniture maker, whatever, that has a number of journeymen working under him, learning the trade or whatever. Marx is saying all
Yeah.
that's happened is that's gotten exploded to a much larger
Right.
scale.
Well, I think that that's important. I think that this is actually starting to click for me. I'm just looking at the first sentence there of the next paragraph. The difference at first was purely quantitative, right? The only thing happening was that it was numerically getting larger. But eventually, there is a qualitative shift as well. And that comes when the capitalist employs enough people to affect the social average of production.
Yeah, that's
So-
what he gets to on the next page.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense there. So that maybe that's the distinction, is that the capitalist is the. It does actually make sense, because he says it's like when he says that when he says the capitalist isn't a capitalist because he's an industrial leader, he becomes an industrial commander because he is a capitalist, right? The largeness of the corporation has gotten to the point where he's literally driving the industry because he's setting the standard for social production. He's setting the social average, I should say. So maybe that's the distinction, right? In the previous forms of cooperation, it wasn't affecting a social average of production for a specific commodity. That doesn't really make sense, especially because I'm still thinking about the fucking pyramids.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about slavery,
Yeah.
and like the same could be said of a feudal lord or something. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
I don't know. I guess that would. Now I'm thinking about, like, because a feudal lord doesn't necessarily affect a social average for anything outside of his own space. In terms of, well, I don't know, actually.
I mean, the social relation is different. That
Yeah.
I guess maybe that's the defining marker there, but like there's no need for a socially necessary average under slavery. You know what I mean?
Right, but it's still that. Oh, that's tricky. The capitalist makes the goods, they affect the social average, and then it goes onto the market, so it determines the price of goods for everyone, assumedly. I mean, obviously, there's assumptions being held here.
The price of goods and the value of labor for someone that's entering into the market as a laborer when they have to sell them their labor and no longer belong to themselves.
I'm confused here. I've confused myself. So yeah, if you know the distinction between historical cooperation and capitalistic cooperation, you can let us know at leftandrightfeedback@gmail.com.
Please.
Yeah. That's the one thing I'm a little confused on still here. I mean, everything else he says about economies of scale, how cooperation benefits the capitalist, makes perfect sense. I just don't understand what differentiates it from the historical mode, you know? And it's all the normal things. I mean, I love on 296, a room that houses 20 weavers and their 20 looms has to be larger than one where a single independent weaver and two apprentices perform their labor, but it takes less labor to build a single workshop for 20 people than it does to build 10 separate workshops for 10 groups of 2 workers.
Yeah. This is where that I was getting at scale and the means of production matter in the context of productivity and how much surplus value can be kind of wrung out of a particular labor process.
Totally.
I mean, he uses the example of rooms. I, of course, am always thinking of it in the context of like furniture making or whatever. If you want to hire one furniture maker to make furniture, you have to have one table saw. If you want 5 furniture makers to make furniture, you could still make that happen with one table saw.
Yeah.
The cost of that one table saw is kind of amortized across all of them. So the cost of necessary labor goes down per laborer, because it's kind of amortized across them all.
The one machine's value is spread out among the 5 laborers.
Workers.
Yeah, exactly.
That has a significant impact on the amount of surplus value that can be generated. And he says on 297, these shared means of production take on this character of being necessary conditions of social labor or necessary social conditions of labor, even when workers perform their labor in the same space but don't work directly with one another.
I think that, it goes into the same thing about the table saw, right? The 5 workers aren't necessarily working with each other, but you're still getting the benefit of having the scale because you still only had to pay for the input of the one table saw.
Yeah, and I don't remember what chapter it was. You're better at recalling things like that than I am. But the point that Marx was making about how the capitalist basically doesn't want downtime on a machine because that's time that it's not being productive. Yeah. It's the same sort of thing. You buy one table saw and you hire one worker for 10 hours a day. That's 14 hours in a day that table saw isn't being in use. You can buy one table saw and hire 2 laborers for 10 hours a day and just put them on different shifts.
Right, yeah.
Now you're doubling your production on the same means of cost.
We didn't in the working day chapter, he talks a lot about the shift system. I mean, he talks we barely mentioned it, but it is totally hand in hand with what we're talking about here. It's the same thing in scale. We won't address the ladder effect until volume 3.
Volume 3.
Yeah.
Gets me every time he throws that shit out.
I've just heard, man, that volume 2 is so dry and so arduous, even compared to volume 1. I'm like, oh God, I don't know if I can do it. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm just going to be happy when we make it through this.
Yes, when we finish Volume 1 of Capital, brother, I'm popping non-alcoholic champagne, okay? Because I will be thrilled.
Well, I mean, we've already kind of belabored the point a little bit, I guess, but the whole premise that he's setting up in the opening pages of this chapter is effectively that there is a significant difference between the sum total of individual labor and the sum total of cooperative labor. And he gives us a bunch of examples. I'll just throw out a couple other quotes. On 298, hence a dozen people working together during a workday, one amounting to a combined 144 man-hours, will produce much more than either the combined output of 12 isolated workers during a 12-hour day or the output of one isolated worker over 12 12-hour days.
Yeah.
So even if you have the same amount of labor time in literally number of hours, you can increase the output of those laborers by having them work cooperatively for the same amount of time. And he kind of just keeps building that. A couple other quotes.
Yeah, I love on 300, he says, when 100 workers cooperate, a single 12-hour workday is a workday of 1,200 hours.
Exactly.
You know?
Something that I did find interesting, and it's kind of related to that, is on 301.
Mm-hmm.
He says, there's productive power of social labor. He says, this power arises from cooperation itself. When a worker works together with others systematically, he breaks through his limitations as an individual and develops the productive capacities of his own species.
Yes. This gets into the biggest point I had here.
Oh, okay.
And it goes back to where we were on earlier on 306. When you said the individuals hadn't managed to tear the umbilical cord tying them to their clan any more than individual bees tear the bond of their hive, right? This is just what I wrote down here, is that capitalism allows the individual expression by detachment from the collective. Marx earlier says that cooperation allows them to surpass their individual capacity, and it made me think of when we were reading Beyond Nature, because he says the same thing. You know, we detached ourselves from the collective of nature to then surpass our productive capabilities at the time, and the goal then is to reform back into nature. There's a similar structure happening here, where there is a collective communal structure in prehistory, or whatever, the pre-Neolithic societies, and then we have broken them off. We've broken the individual off for the purposes of surpassing the productive capacity of the individual. There was just an odd parallel there between the way that we've split the individual off from the collective, with the goal, our goal ultimately, of bringing them back together, a collective that maintains that surpassed productive power.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. When I read this line, I was just like, why is that even necessary, though? Like, I don't understand how the splitting to develop the individual makes us more productive when we come back together to work cooperatively.
Well, it's because we've set a social standard, right? We've created, rather than us relying on individual productivity, we're now relying on socialized productivity, and the cooperative productivity is greater.
The idea being that because the capitalist has come in and reformed the mode of production so much that the capitalist can go through this process where they're squeezing all of this surplus value and ultimately increasing production through scale and all of the different things that we've been talking about, that then the expectations of the
necessity of society becomes socialized as well, right?
What do you mean by that? Because what I was getting at is like all that does is increase the social expectation of labor. It doesn't increase our individual capacity to meet that expectation, other than by continuing to participate under the same mode of production.
Well, I don't necessarily think so, because we're talking about cooperative work, right? We're still utilizing that. Well, actually, now I'm confused too, man. Well, no, it's because we're utilizing that cooperative structure, that socialized structure, that under capitalist cooperation, which has a higher productive capability than historical cooperation, I suppose. But I'm just thinking about when we talked about the means of production became socialized, but the means of ownership, the ownership of those means did not. Mm-hmm. The change in the ownership of those still maintains the social productive capability of it.
Yeah, I'm getting a little lost in the weeds on this one.
Yeah, I don't know.
You're probably right.
No, don't say that.
I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around how being forced into a capitalist mode of production from some historical mode of cooperative production somehow makes me more productive as an individual, it develops my productive capacity. I guess I'm thinking of it in a very individualistic sense. I'm thinking of it from the point of view of the individual,
Right.
not from the point of view of society.
Well, that's the thing, is that societally our productive forces have increased. They've increased from the historical modes of production because of our split into capitalism, right? What that capitalism is the splitting off of the individual from the collective in order to more further exploit their surplus productivity. Because the individual ceases to become the individual when they enter into the process of capital.
Yeah.
So we're taking that individual away from the original social collective, entering them into this process, which is then exploiting their labor to create a surplus. That process, on the whole, is raising our productive capacity as a society. The question of what comes next, though, from the lens of the capitalist, the end goal is nothing, to continue growth forever, right? But if we're talking about taking this expanded productive capacity and refocusing it into a socially owned mode of production, I suppose, then we're still maintaining that productive capacity.
Yes, you're correct. It's all clicking for me now, finally. Because, I 100% agreed with Marx on the point that I just read the quote from, where it's 12 workers working 12-hour days individually is not going to be as productive as 12 hours working cooperatively for a 12-hour day.
Yeah.
Because the division of their labor or the productive capacity of their labor can be organized in a way to be more productive when they're doing it cooperatively. It takes me, say, 30 hours to build a table, where if my job was to mill lumber for 10 hours a day, where someone else can also be taking the lumber that I'm milling and at the same time going through the next process and the next process and so forth. Tables will be made it will take much fewer than 30 hours to build that table, where if I did it all by myself, it would take that 30 hours. So I'm understanding now my adherence to looking at it from an individualistic lens was the sticking point there. But to zoom out and think of it socially, I think is correct. Your point that the productive capacity of a capitalist mode of production still exists once we even move beyond a capitalist mode, that is what he's talking about. Thank you. That helped it all click for me.
Okay. Well, do you want to talk about the overseers and things here? That was kind of my next point.
Yeah, that's the thing that I liked the most out of these chapters, to be honest, is Marx explaining why supervisors exist.
Yeah, totally.
It starts, I guess, on 302, really?
Yeah, I was looking at the bottom where he says a single violin player is his own conductor, but an orchestra can't conduct itself.
Yeah, I have one above that, just as an introduction to it. He says, but as many wage laborers are brought together to cooperate, capital's control becomes necessary for carrying out the labor process. It becomes an actual precondition for production. I was thinking a lot about email jobs, actually.
Yeah.
The bullshit jobs that you were talking about that I'd never heard about before. But it's there are two reasons why that becomes necessary under a capitalist mode of production. One, because there's value in the means of production that needs to be protected. And so, you hire a supervisor to make sure that workers aren't mistreating the means of production or wearing them down faster than they need to. So there's that. It's you're protecting the investment of the means of production, I guess. The other two is just to further exploit the workers, to find ways to continue to further increase productivity or whatever, quote unquote.
God, even psychologically, I mean, having someone present that you know is watching you changes your behavior.
Yeah.
I don't mean to extend the metaphor so loosely, but an orchestra can conduct itself. They just do it much more poorly, So it's an apt metaphor here because the introduction of a conductor, maybe of a central authority, increases the productive forces, believe it or not. Just an interesting note.
Fucking commie statist. No, but the other point about supervisors, back to the point about protecting the means of production, there's Marx speaks on that. On 303, he says, similarly, as the means of production are enlarged and wage laborers work with greater amounts of property owned by someone else, the need to supervise the use of this property to make sure that it is being used correctly becomes greater as well. So policing the means of production becomes a primary reason why the supervisory role needs to exist. But the other and perhaps more important one is as capitalist production continues to expand and demands a larger workforce to be exploited, with that comes the fear of resistance. And Marx is bringing that up on 303, kind of talking about how class antagonisms can become something that need to be nipped in the bud, so to speak.
Yes, the unavoidable antagonism, he says.
Exactly. As the number of workers used simultaneously increases, so does the resistance they bring forth, and the pressure that capital applies to overcome their resistance necessarily grows as well. You put too many workers in a room and push them too hard, they're going to start talking to one another about how there are 100 of us and one of them.
Dude, it's like, I am very open with how much I make. Even the most progressive people that I meet in the job, that's still that one point of reticence where they're like, I don't want to say what my wage is, you know?
Fuck that.
Yeah.
Be open about how much money you make.
Dude, it's even to the point, I've looked at the law on it because I keep it on the fucking board in the break room.
Of course.
Obviously, you can't be stopped from telling other people how much you make, but if somebody tells you how much they make and then you tell somebody else, that's a violation.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense in terms of privacy and whatnot, but man, I mean, how telling, right? How telling. Did I tell you about when we were at it was right before I quit. All the freshman teachers sat down and we were just talking about, like, you know, the conditions we were working in or whatever. And I was just like, I just want to let y'all know that I make $58,000 a year, you know, or whatever. And that was like a ripple through the room. Not because people were making less than me, but because people weren't making that much more, you know, than this fucking Teach for America scab that just came in. You know, so it's just, I mean, even in a very lovely place, it's still apparent that the way that we the unavoidable antagonism, so to speak. You know?
It's a means of control. It's a boot on the neck of workers to this, like, social stigma that comes along with talking about how much you make.
Yeah.
That only benefits the capitalist.
Right. Transparency would benefit the worker in every regard, except for the fact that then they would understand that they have to do something about their boss.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Fuck that shit. You should tell people how much you make, and people should tell you how much they make.
Exactly.
And if you're both making too little, you should do something about it.
There's one other quote on 303, just a quick one, but to your point about being a supervisor and being kind of forced into a more tyrannical kind of attitude toward the people that work under you, he says, Marx even writes that in terms of its form, capitalist leadership is despotic. This despotism develops its own peculiar form of cooperation, starts to take place on a larger scale. And then he uses that to lead into an army analogy.
Yeah.
He says, as an army needs officers, a large group of workers cooperating under the command of a single mass of capital requires industrial high officers and also lower officers, all of whom issue orders during the labor process in the name of capital.
Dude, I mean, the ultimate tool in the arsenal is violence. You know, it's a threat.
That's why I think the army analogy is so good.
Perfect, yeah. Do my bidding or else, you know? Do as I please or else I will take away your livelihood, you know? So yeah, of course it's despotic. Of course it's tyrannical. You know, I can only influence someone to do my bidding in so many ways. Ultimately, the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, is a threat.
Yep.
Sick. Love this. Love this system.
That's all I got.
I think that was it, man. Do you want to hit the cavalcade and then we'll just fucking round it out?
Sure, though I think I only had one quote marked for cavalcade and you already read it.
Oh. Let me see if I have anything here. I actually don't even know if I have anything.
The only other thing I would call out that isn't worth it if we're not going to do a cavalcade is that Marx just reading for filth Edmund Burke. He calls him a famous sophist and sycophant and then goes on to just demolish him on 295. I just thought it was funny.
Yeah.
I don't know who Edmund Burke is. Sorry. He's some bourgeois economist.
Yeah, a
one would
sycophant,
assume.
apparently.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, this was a really light section, you know, 23 pages. I mean, I crushed through it right away. I took some time to listen to the Harvey lectures. You know, I read through the sections here, but it didn't really give me anything that was that exciting.
Yeah, same.
Word.
Nice, light, easy read.
Yeah. Great job, reader. I hope you were with us.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, what questions did you have? I think mine was, we addressed pretty much, you know, what really differentiates capitalistic cooperation to historical cooperation. If you have a key to that, let us know. I know that when we kind of got into that, it was probably a little muddled, but regardless, that's a question on my mind still.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. If you, listener, have an idea, again, let us know, leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah. And also, If you have anything you want to recommend, any feedback for us, obviously the email has feedback in the name.
I will say, just to add, and I've said it a few times, I guess, but it's been really great corresponding with folks through that. It's been nice that we have been getting feedback a little bit more frequently lately, and it's been a lot of fun corresponding with folks back and forth. So any thoughts, even if you just want to chit-chat about theory or whatever, hit us up.
Hit us up, for real.
It's been fun.
Absolutely.
And it's very validating for a show as small as ours to have folks reach out, and it definitely helps energize me.
Yeah. And, you know, we're operating in good faith here, man. You know, if you have a criticism, fucking send it to us. We won't be angry, I promise. We had a bunch of anarchists yell at us on the YouTube video, and I think the only thing I really got from it was good recommendations. You know? Or at least interesting ones.
Yeah, to be determined.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Anarchist Primer 2. If you have any recommendations for the Anarchist Primer 2, let us know at leftonredfeedback@gmail.com.
Perfect. And then next go around, we have been hungry for some theory, so we are going to jump back into Stalin.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. Speaking of anarchists, it made me feel shaky in my principles, right? We're ostensibly Leninists. I know that we have some arguments with maybe some of the strategy of Lenin itself, or the outcome of Lenin's strategy per se. But regardless, I really wanted to read this because I wanted a firmer foundation on Leninism, what that actually means. What does it mean for us to establish the party? Is the party even still valid? That's still a question on my mind. The last time a party was successful, 100 fucking years ago. So why are we still doing a party? Is it still worth it? I don't know. That's been on my mind a lot, especially as we have been reading other things a la anarchism.
Yeah, so we are going to read The Foundations of Leninism by Joseph Stalin.
Joseph? Yeah.
The man of steel himself. Join us, won't you?
Oh, and don't get left on red. Bingo.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.